Welcome back, my dear crime lovers. This is a new episode of the history of the American Mafia. Written for podcast by Fabio Fabiano and translated and read by me, Grace Cutlisi. I hope you truly enjoy this new episode. The Atlantic City Conference. Once Masseria and Maranzano, the two old New York Mafia bosses, had been eliminated, Lucky Luciano became the de facto boss of the bosses. But unlike his predecessors, he decided not to undertake the role. As I've already told you in my previous podcasts about Lucky Luciano, he set up a commission in which there were representatives of all the 5 New York families. There were representatives from Chicago and the Buffalo family, and granted the authorization to anyone to collaborate with non-Sicilian and non-Italian gangsters, thus giving life to the then renamed National Crime Syndicate. This, which might seem like a great intuition of Luciano's, was nothing more than the continuation of a concept that had been developed several years earlier. These ideas had already been elaborated in 1927 with the forming of the Big Seven Group. Said organization was so called because it was originally composed of 7 independent power groups. It included Luciano and Frank Costello from Manhattan, Joe Adonis from Brooklyn and part of Manhattan, Longy Zwillman from New Jersey and Long Island, New York, Waxy Gordon and Philadelphia's nascent Nick Rosen, Atlantic City's Nucky Johnson, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, exponents of the Jewish American underworld. Johnny Torrio, who had retired in Brooklyn, also participated and offered to dispense organizational advice. It is difficult to say who is credited with the originating of the idea. It was probably Arnold Rothstein, also called the Brain, or maybe Johnny Torrio, who was also nicknamed the Brain or sometimes the Mind. Subsequently, in May 1929, in a renowned location on the Atlantic coast, precisely in Atlantic City, the idea developed during a meeting of the members of the Big Seven Group and the most important gangsters of the United States. Atlantic City earned the nickname of the world's playground during the Roaring Twenties. During Prohibition, there was a vast network of clubs or nightclubs, the so-called speakeasies, where people enjoyed themselves at a green table among sequin-dressed dancers and swing musicians. Atlantic City was a tourist destination. The success of the city was due to the ability to provide what visitors were looking for: alcohol, gambling, and prostitutes. Incidentally, we could say it's just another incredible coincidence. In early May 1929, Meyer Lansky, the head of the American Jewish Crime Syndicate, got married. At that point, the Jewish gangster Lucky Luciano's great friend and associate of his closest underworld friends decided that Atlantic City in New Jersey would be the ideal place to spend his honeymoon. In this way, Lansky could mix pleasure and criminal business, meeting the top leaders of all the American criminal organizations. Furthermore, under Prohibition, gangster groups settled their scores with bloodshed in fighting and territorial disagreements to get their hands on large chunks of the illegal market. The climax arrived in 1929 in Chicago with the Valentine's Day Massacre. In truth, the Chicago confrontation was just one of many atrocities related to gang warfare. Public opinion and law enforcement had grown tired of all the violence. Although actually, it was not only the police who wanted to eliminate or at least mitigate the acts of violence. The media uproar from the heinous murders and massacres proved harmful for the illicit business. Therefore, the mafia worked out a strategy for damage containment. The objective to be pursued was the realization of a long-term plan, which in theory would have avoided further violent events. So, as I was saying earlier, the most important gangsters decided to meet safely, to agree on a neutral place. Although there were several obvious advantages that Atlantic City offered, it is reasonable to ask why that was the chosen location. At this point, it's necessary to introduce the man who organized the event. He took care of the organization of the conference as well as its logistics and the accommodation of the participants. He was the politician and criminal Nucky Johnson. Nucky, who had a stake in issues at hand, was the undisputed boss of the Republican Party that controlled Atlantic City. He used his political position to run the city as a refuge from prohibition. In fact, his criminal organization was involved in the smuggling of alcohol, gambling and prostitution. The conference was set for the weekend of May the 13th to the 16th in 1929. It was considered by most historians to be the first organized crime summit held in the United States. The conference will be remembered as the first concrete step towards the creation of the National Crime Syndicate that would eventually control all the major criminal activity in the United States. So, the most important lords of crime arrived in Atlantic City in mid-May 1929, mainly Italians and Jewish, flanked by their trusted entourage of advisors and bodyguards. Guests came from the Midwest, New England, Philadelphia, New York, Detroit, and even Florida. The largest delegation to the conference came from New York, New Jersey, and included mobsters like Johnny the Fox Torrio, formerly from Chicago, Charlie Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Giuseppe Joe Adonis Dotto, and Vito Genovese, the top of the Manhattan's powerful Masseria family members. Representing the D'Aquila Mineo family from Manhattan, there was Albert the Mad Hatter, Anastasia, Frank Cheech Scalisi, and Vincent Mangano. Gaetano Tommy Brown Lucchese, representing the Reina family from the Bronx. Guarino Willie Moore Moretti, representing Newark and New Jersey. Then, as I've already said, there was Meyer Lansky and Benny Bugsky Siegel, who were in charge of shipping liquor to the areas of New York and New Jersey. Jacob Shapiro, considered the Rockefeller of the underworld, also known as the Guerrilla Boys from New Jersey. Dutch Schultz beat bootlegger from the Bronx and Harlem boss Frank Erickson, Rothstein's former right-hand man. Rothstein was Costello's partner and future betting boss. He was assassinated probably over a huge gambling debt he owed to professional gamblers. Chicago was represented by Alphonse Scarface Capone, his bodyguard Frank Klein, Rio, Frank the Enforcer, Nitty Jake, Greasy Thumb Guzik, prominent members of the Southside Capone gang and who represented the interests of the Midwest, and only one of two Irish gangsters, Frank McLean, from the South Side. From Philadelphia came top Jewish American gangster leaders Ivering Waxy Gordon Wexler, Harry Nig Rosen Stromberg, Max Boo Boo Hof, Irving Bitsy Bitts, and Charles Schwartz. From Cleveland there was Morris Mo Dalitz and Lou Roddy, along with the adopted Polizzi family member Charles Polizzi, representing the Mayfield Road mob from Little Italy. Detroit's dreaded Purple Gang, represented by Abe Bernstein and his brother Joseph Bugs Bill Bernstein. Boston's most prominent bootlegger, Charles King Solomon, while Kansas City was represented by boss John Lazia. Delegations from Florida and Louisiana were also present. Most likely, allies to Luciano and Costello, Santo Trafficante from Tampa, and Silvestro Silver Sam Carolla from New Orleans. The two rivals from New York, Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, did not attend because they were not invited. The old mustaches, as the new generation of Italian gangsters called them, would never approve of Italian mobsters working or ganging up on criminal activities with criminals from other ethnic backgrounds. Their mentality and social upbringing prevented them from working with other ethnic gangs outside the Italian underworld. Luciano and Torrio, Italian-American gangsters of the new generation, didn't fit into these selective principles of the old Sicilian bosses, and during the conference took advantage of the occasion to express to other delegates in Atlantic City their disappointment with the ideals of the old Italian mafiosi who were clashing in New York. At the time of the conference, future mob boss Joseph Joe Bonanno, Maranzano's top lieutenant, was not invited to Atlantic City, but this didn't prevent him from subsequently becoming one of the most important promoters of the National Criminal Syndicate and of the Cosa Nostra Commission. The leaders who attended the conference all agreed that in order to continue with the Union's future plans, the old mustached guard would eventually have to be eliminated. It was understood that the group composed of Charlie Luciano and Meyer Lansky from New York, together with their allies, the young Italian mobsters, up and coming, would have to finally settle the score, once the right time came, with the old mafia bosses from New York. This led Benjamin, Budsky, Siegel, and Lansky to disband the Bugs and Meyer mob group and found their own organization, Murder Enclosed, several years later working on Luciano's behalf as hitman. Before Siegel moved to California in the late 1930s, the organization passed to Albert Anastasia and Luis Buchalter. Work in Atlanta began on May the 13th. For the first 3 days, parties were organized in the various hotels. Nucky Johnson took care to provide the prestigious guests with liquor, food, and girls to entertain them. For attendees who brought their wives or girlfriends, Johnson presented the ladies with fur coats. Meyer Lansky, newlywed and guest of honor, stayed in the presidential suite at the Ritz Hotel and was complimented with constant supply of champagne for him and his wife Anna. The conference had a major impact on the future direction of the criminal underworld. Crime leaders at the conference discussed the violent wars raging between bootlegging gangs in New York and Chicago and how to avoid them in the future. Important decisions were made to stop gang fighting and to cooperate and pool their resources to maximize profits and develop a national monopoly in the illegal liquor trade. They set themselves the problem of diversifying investments into legal enterprises for the production of liquor. One of the most important discussions was what the future would be like after Prohibition. The leaders decided to reorganize and transform their criminal gangs into legal organizations such as cooperatives, investing in the management of breweries, distilleries, and franchises for importing liquor. In summary, they would have legally invested in the liquor business, even owning nightclubs, cafes, and restaurants to distribute the liquor and maximize profits. This would have allowed members of the criminal syndicate some security after the repeal of Prohibition. The delegates discussed how to improve the profits of illegal gambling activities and to establish cooperatives to manage betting, horse racing, and casinos. Representatives from New York and Chicago hatched a plan to link the National News Agency for racehorsing bettors with the daily racing form and to license and place wagers throughout the United States. The New York and Chicago families would oversee and direct the operations of this highly profitable new gambling venture. New York bosses Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky were chosen as directors to coordinate operations alongside Chicago representatives. Gambling czar Frank Erickson was chosen to oversee the organization of the operation along with Moses Anberg from Chicago. Before the end of the conference, emphasis was placed that all future plans and operations must be planned and managed peacefully among the heads of the country's criminal organizations, avoiding the kind of violent conflict that had plagued the underworld in the past. All these principles and themes were fully realized when Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano managed to eliminate the old Sicilian bosses Masseria and Maranzano, and Charles Luciano reached the pinnacle of criminal power in the United States of America.